Let us pray. God, whose Spirit moved over the deep, we thank you for the gift of water. The waters on the earth and under the earth, the water above us, the water within us, and the water of baptism, in which we are adopted as your children. Make us mindful of the care of all the planet's water, that it may richly sustain life for us and for those who come after us, through Jesus Christ, source of the living water. Amen.
Amen. This is primarily a cypress tupelo swamp. We will see thornless honey locusts, we will see oaks, we will see maples, we will see willows, and then of course our Taxodium distichum, the bald cypress, which we see around us. A lot of them will have holes inside of them. Most of the Taxodium distichum, they're hollow, and so they're habitat for many cool creatures, but I'll get into that later. But this is a very special place. The forest around us is a bottomland hardwood forest. It would have originally been longleaf pine savannas. So a very tall, all around this swamp, it would have been a very tall canopy of these giant longleaf pines. No underbrush underneath. It would have been a carpet of pine needles. And the first Europeans, the first scouts wrote in their diaries that when they came up here inland, that you could ride a horse at a full gallop for miles underneath the pines, the longleaf pine savanna. So it was just a carpet of pine straw and this giant old growth pine forest. So that would have been surrounding this creek. And then when you get to this creek proper, it would have looked pretty much like what we see now, except for we would have seen more larger trees. But we've got all sorts of reptiles and amphibians. We've got squirrels, an amazing array of bird species. This is an important nesting habitat for many of the beloved birds that we see at the coast. Herons and egrets, they actually nest in these swamps, and they fly to the marshes and to the coast to feed, but usually in the evenings they fly back and nest in these swamps because they're a little safer. So we'll see, what do we have right there? There we go, that's a night heron.
Okay.
So I'll try to point out any nests that I might see. A lot of times they're at the top of these cypress trees.
Do you know what this plant is? Is it some sort of a plant?
So that is it's a lily. It's a, I think the native name is like catawba lily.
Okay.
But it's, many people call them spider lilies.
Spider lilies.
Spider lilies, and we'll see a lot of them.
Thank you.
Those are, yes, they're beautiful, the little white spider lilies. We'll also see purple clematis out here, which are pretty rare. And if I can find any of the little swamp orchids, I will point them out, but they are very hard to find and see. We'll see on the sides, on a lot of the older dead trees, you'll see these little markers, these little signs. And so the Butler Conservation Fund, they send people out here every now and then to put up these markers to help navigate. This is a water trail, and this goes deep into the swamps, but it also will kick back out into the Black River about a mile upriver. The way that the river flows, this isn't a tidal river, so it doesn't rise, and it might rise maybe a few inches, but it doesn't really rise and ebb like our rivers down closer to the coast. So instead, this is a constant flow, and so this is a very slow, constant flow through this swamp, back out that way, which will eventually kick out to the river as well. So no matter what, if you follow that slow flow, you're going to get back home to the landing. Often you'll see kind of these little channels, these straight lines. Anytime you see a straight line in the swamp, that was man-made. And so that's a good example. About, I guess it's now 80 years, so in the 1920s and 30s, loggers came through and cleared a lot of this area. There were two main, I guess we'll say, logging efforts. Right before the Civil War, so the first kind of big post-colonial expansion, there was a huge logging effort, and that's where a lot of the largest trees were originally cut back in the middle 1800s. And then again, in the 1920s and 30s, the timber industry came through and cleared out most of these swamps. A lot of the oldest trees that you see are hollow, and that's why they're still around, is because the timber industry, they couldn't make money, or the hollow trees weren't as valuable. And the trees hollow out in their latter stage of life. It's a very interesting adaptation that we'll get into more in a second. Imagine, well, what's it going to look like in another 100 years? You know, how, as long as we don't screw everything else up, this might be an incredibly, even more pristine and dense and thick. This swamp is, there could be an extinct species that we might see today, the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker. Yeah. Around the turn of the century, they were out here, and they were hunted, and they were also taken out by habitat loss, by those big first initial logging pushes, but then also an avian flu swept through the area. And we believe that the avian flu is what wiped out the Carolina parakeets. So in the 1800s, you could have come out here and it would have been chattering with parrots. If you come out right before that big first logging push, all the canopies would have been full of these small yellow and green parakeets chittering about. They fed on the nuts that the cypress trees produce, and they lived in the holes. They nested in the caverns within these trees. And so it would have been quite spectacular. It would have been like a cacophony of chittering and sounds. And the Europeans, when they came out here, they realized, ooh, the ladies back in Europe would really love those feathers for their hats. And so they started to kill all the birds. They had essentially a large shotgun called a punt gun. They would come out and spray the trees, and that combined with an avian flu took out our parakeets. But the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker, similar story, the largest woodpecker in the world, almost the size of like a large owl. They look a lot like the pileated woodpecker, which we still have, and they were last photographed in the 1940s, and they once were here. And in 2006, in Louisiana and in Arkansas, teams of ornithologists signed off and verified that the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker is not extinct, that they're still around in maybe very small numbers. And so this is a place where they could possibly be. If the Ivory-Bill is still in South Carolina, this would be one of the most likely places, along with the Santee Delta and the Santee River. So there's a chance if you see a really large black woodpecker, it could be an Ivory-Bill.
Does it have white on it?
It has white. It looks a lot like a pileated, but less red. Black and white for the most part. The males have a little tuft of red.
Upcall has a good area with the long leaf pines where you can see the flats.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of efforts right now to bring back our longleaf savannas. The Cypress Preserve is really working on it. Hobcaw has probably made the most progress. And you can imagine they're thinking that, yeah, in maybe 70 years, essentially that old growth pine will get tall enough and that bed of pine straw will really get dense. And I mean, imagine what that would look like. You're in a pine forest of these huge pines all growing together, no underbrush, you know, and almost like the sequoia forests, obviously a little smaller. But I think it's fascinating to imagine what this place would have looked like, and we're working on getting it back to that shape in pockets. So when I come out to these places and I film, I'm chasing lore I'm chasing stories, things that I heard when I was a kid. And one of the myths, the big famous lore of this area, the Carolina panther, the black panther.
Right.
And I've interviewed a lot of people about it. And my conclusion is that they were here. I don't believe they're here any longer. And there's a big misunderstanding. So y'all know about Rocky Mountain lions, right? The western cougar, the eastern cougar, and the Florida panthers,
Right.
which they're of the puma family, but they're the tawny tan cats. They are here. They are verified in South Carolina. They've been picked up on game cameras. They are here in very small. They migrate very far, so they're migrating down from the Appalachian Mountains, or maybe migrating up from Florida. But we do have mating pairs, extremely rare.
Right.
But the Black Panther story is actually talking about melanistic jaguar.
Oh, wow.
So if you look around at this ecosystem, I have yet to visit the Amazon, but I've been down to Honduras and Costa Rica, so pretty similar. And this is about as close as you'll get in North America to a South American type climate. This is a rainforest, and we know that jaguar range up into Texas. And then prior to European settlement, jaguar were here in the Carolinas. We had jaguar here, we had the American cheetah, and we also had the American lion.
Oh, neat.
And when the first Europeans came, John Lawson, he describes lions and tigers.
Wow.
And we believe that the tigers he was describing, those were jaguar. And so jaguar sometimes will have a melanistic, they'll come out black or dark brown. And so the idea is that there was a population of jaguar that survived in these swamps. And maybe for some reason, the melanistic jaguar, it was more likely that they reproduced, or there was more melanistic jaguar in this area. So when I was a boy, we lived next to an old farmer named C.B. Robinson, and he would hunt with dogs. He'd send the dogs out to the forest. I don't know what he was hunting, but once his dog went missing, and he went on this trek into the forest. This was in the early 80s on horseback, and he found his dog, and he said it had been cut up he said that sides looked like it had been cut up like ribbons. And he tracked down this Black Panther, and he shot the Black Panther. And so I've heard many people tell stories of seeing Black Panthers. Again, I don't necessarily think they're still here, but I know they were here at one point, and maybe up until as recently as 30, 40 years ago. But I think it's very cool that when you come out to these places and you look into this forest, I mean, can you imagine a large, dark cat slowly stalking through?
Right.
It's,
There's still panthers in Charlotte.
Yep. Well, and so that lore is what inspired, the Carolina Panther name, and so those are things that, it's kind of part of this culture that we want to keep alive. I want to get more kids out here and inspire them with this experience, because that's how with the world going virtual, we've got to do something to inspire a conservation ethic, long term. That's a fawn.
Oh, dear.
Little baby deer.
Oh.
He didn't make it very far. I could go get him.
They were good in my yard.
So this creek has a long human history, and and I like to go back and think about the natives, but also I think it's interesting to think about the more recent human history. If you look at this log here, it's at some point that fell, and obviously to still maintain passage, they cut it. But every time I pass that log, I imagine going back 50 years and maybe seeing a boy sitting on that log with a cane pole fishing as his dad maybe paddles up. Ever since the settlement of this area, it's gone through periods of the timber industry. Yeah, pileateds. The timber industry and then regrowth. And then 70 years later, the timber industry came in and then regrowth. And so in those periods of regrowth, the people that live out here, this is their playground. And so imagine the people 50 years ago that were out here and, the advent of imagine the first motorized john boat that came out here. Think about the first people to ski. Maybe not here, but out on the river proper. I think so. That's kind of part of the interesting adaptation that I'll go into.
What's the purple plant?
We've got beaver sign. A beaver's been sharpening his teeth right there. I think he realized that tree was too large.
Wow.
But you can see that.
Wow.
All right, this is where I'm going to need to get out and help y'all. Maybe not. Woo! We've got a barred owl watching us for the newcomers. So I'm not too concerned with gators, but alligator snapping turtles are very common out here. And they are so powerful they could bite right through these boots.
Whoa.
And they are a pretty crazy prehistoric looking creature.
Are they territorial?
They're not, but they are aggressive. So they're not going to come to get you, but if you step on them, they're going to let you know.
Oh, wow.
And the big ones can get to be like the size of
Huge.
They,
Gracious.
and they're so strong that if you stand on top of them, the people that, I know they're crazy people that go and catch them, catch the big gator turtles. You could stand on the back of them and they'll lift you up and walk around with you on top.
Commercial.
Wow.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Have you ever done that, Marsh?
Nope. I like my fingers and toes, and so I love critters, but I'm not one that, I don't need to pick up an animal that can like hurt me for life. Is that friend still watching? So this is right up here. This is kind of where it opens up. This is Big Bend. So we can kind of chill here, paddle around for a little bit while we get everyone through. Okay. And we will continue on that way. There's a dead end, but we'll go check it out real quick. You can just lift your paddle up and hold it parallel to the kayak, just so it doesn't get snagged. And then you might have to use it as a pole once we get through this spot.
Got it. Thank you.
You want to, I'll do that.
I'm just gonna get it out of the way.
Well, so now this is a cool thing, is the first Europeans here were the Spanish, and they were here in the 1500s, and so imagine this little expedition, but in wooden dugout canoes. They only probably had a few of them. They had mules and horses. They were probably actually walking through this sort of terrain, most of them, and they were completely out of their element. They were wearing their conquistador armor with guns and you know, imagine and they had this dream of finding gold. So they're out here like looking for El Dorado. They've heard these rumors from the settlements down in South America. And so you can kind of put yourself in their shoes. What would it have been like for those Spanish? Romping through these swamps with alligators. Almost there. One kind of interesting fact is that snowy egrets that we all love at the beach, like if you go to Huntington Beach State Park, everyone wants to take photos of all the birds. The snowy egrets, the tricolored herons, the great blue herons, they were all hunted for their feathers. And one of the there's a rookery, an egret, a snowy egret rookery on the Santee, which is only 40 miles, maybe, 40, 30 miles south of here at the southern border of Georgetown County. That rookery of snowy egrets, they believe, was the very last remaining rookery that saved the entire species. And so all of the snowy egrets that we so love can all go back to a single rookery in a place like this on the Santee River. All the snowy egrets come from that one spot in the 1800s. They were just indiscriminately wiped out. They're there now. So now we have snowy egrets everywhere. And they had one of the most amazing rebounds. All of our wading birds had amazing rebounds after the first, plumage. They wanted the plumage for their, the aristocracy's hats and dresses, and the king wanted the exotic looking feathers. They were prized. So it's very likely that some of the great blue herons, places like this are responsible for those birds surviving that time period, just because these places just were so inaccessible to the Europeans. If you ever go down to the Santee Coastal Reserve, that is where that rookery at the Santee Coastal Reserve is credited for saving the snowy egret species.
pretty walk.
It's amazing. I love that place.
When you go there, you just see a big tree with a bunch of white birds in it.
Yep. No, sometimes they'll move their rookeries, but a lot of times if the rookery stays unmolested for periods of seasons, that the birds that are born there will just they'll build up the nests each year, and so birds that are born there will then have their chicks there, and so it's like generations of birds at these same rookeries.
Nest in the trees.
Mm-hmm.
On the creek, I'll see a bunch of white birds gathered in trees, but they're
It's a cormorant. There's one tree that all the cormorants, it's interesting. Certain species of birds will make a claim and say, this is our tree. Mm-hmm. So there's one tree that is all cormorants, and then there's another tree that's all snowy egrets. A lot of times a house will come in or something will come in and disrupt the rookery.
Who's yelling?
We okay?
Everyone good? Oh,
What they say?
a snake.
You get something attached to your rudder, Mary, that's following you in the stream.
You have this widened out part of the creek, which very well they could have dug out. This could be a man-made pond out here in the swamp. And it seems likely that they would have done that. Here you can see this little rise. And so all this evidence tells the story that, and also this is, the river snakes around us. If you were to look at a satellite image, the river goes way, way, way around in this big, huge bend. And so this creek that we've been on, then this little lake, and then if we were to continue up this creek another half mile, it's a shortcut. This little shortcut saves probably 2 or 3 miles from the river. And so a lot of indicators point that this would be a very wise place for a settlement. And so you can think that there would have been, all of their houses, all their buildings were made of wood, most likely cypress wood. They would have had long houses. They would have had a dock system. This would have been if you go back pre-colonization, so 1000 AD, this would have been a trade hub between the Indians on the coast and the Indians upriver, or the indigenous. One thing that we do know from the first settlers, they talked about, or the first explorers talked about cities in the Carolinas. Cities comparable to that of the Aztec or the Maya, except for we don't have a lot of stone here, so that's why we don't have pyramids left over. But there were cities, they talked about miles of cultivated corn, rows of corn, squash, agriculture like you can expect today, in a more primitive way. But the big thing is they talked about is that there was a huge trade of shells. There was a huge trade of clams, oysters, mussels, crabs. So the natives that lived way upriver, they wanted those foods that came from the beach. And so just like we do today, right? We like having a varied diet. And so there would have been, this river was the highway, and this was the trade system. So natives from the coast would have been bringing loads, maybe not of the actual clam meat or oysters, but the shells. They'd bring the shells up here. They would bring fish, maybe smoked oysters. They would bring food and materials from the coast, and then the natives from the mountains or from the Piedmont would bring resources that they had, maybe different types of timber, maybe venison, and they would meet in the middle in places probably like this to trade their goods. And so there were huge networks, trade networks, and this river, this spot was part of it. It was part of that highway and that industry that supported millions of people. When the Spanish came, diseases came and wiped out all those people.
Would the British have come up this far in the Revolution?
Mm-hmm. So the first settlers were the Spanish in the 1520s, and They had a settlement in the Winyah Bay, San Miguel de Guadalupe, and that settlement lasted maybe 6 months down probably in Hobcall. It would have been too swampy, too buggy. They were just so out of their element. Settlers, and they had 100 enslaved Africans, and they had, I think, like 50 horses. And when the Spanish left, when they fled, because when they came here, the first thing they did was they captured a bunch of natives, which would have been, we would call them the Waccamaw or the Winyah natives, but really they were the nation that existed before the Waccamaw and the Winyah, because pre-Spanish, it would have been a nation of people. And the Spanish, first thing they did was they captured a bunch of them. They raided a small little. So the European way of doing things was very different than the native way of doing things. And so it was the first war. And we have no real record of it, except for that the natives terrorized the Spanish. And after 6 months, the Spanish went back down to Florida. They left behind their horses. And those horses were the very first horses, Spanish horses, to populate the Americas. That populated this part of the world were here, left behind here. And then also the very first enslaved Africans, 1526. We don't have any record of how many, we don't know how many survived, how long they survived. We don't know how many were left when the Spanish left, but we know that the Spanish didn't bring them back. And so those first African slaves that were left pretty much in this sort of terrain, but in the Hobcall Barony area.
Where would they have come from?
East Africa. I think Benin was the main, modern day Benin. I don't know what it would have been called back then, but that was the main trade hub, the Ivory Coast. They would have been, so the Spanish that came here, they came directly from Hispaniola. Hispaniola was the first, or one of the first, the islands in the Caribbean were first settled in the 1500s, and then they were kind of the embarkation point for the mainland settlement. And so at the same time that Cortez was heading into Aztec country, Avion was heading into Carolina. And anyways, after the Spanish...
Why would they leave the horses and the enslaved people behind?
I believe it was...
They were fleeing?
They were fleeing, but I think it was they had less ships. When they came and made these settlements, a lot of times they would break apart their ships and use the timber to start the settlement. And I think it was a situation where they maybe only had one boat left. And of course, they probably even left settlers. I mean, they most likely, when they fled, they probably would have left people behind and said, oh no, we'll be back. We're going to go get reinforcements. We're going to go get more help. And they just never came back. But the big thing is it's interesting because the people that were left, maybe they were just killed by the natives. Maybe the natives were furious and killed them all. Maybe they just starved, died on their own, or maybe they were brought in. I mean, there are stories of what people say, you know, black Indians. Some of the first settlers seeing black Indians. So maybe they would have survived on and assimilated. We don't know, but for me it's like
from the book of the prophet Ezekiel. He said to me, "Mortal, have you seen this?" Then he led me back along the bank of the river. As I came back, I saw on the bank of the river a great many trees on the one side and on the other. He said to me, "This water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah. And when it enters the sea of stagnant waters, the water will become fresh. Wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live. And there will be very many fish once these waters reach there. It will become fresh, and everything will live where the river goes. People will stand fishing beside the sea from Engedi to Iniglane. It will be a place for the spreading of nets. Its fish will be of a great many kinds, like the fish of the great sea. But its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They are to be left for salt. On the banks on both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month. because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So does everyone have a good view of it?
Yeah.
So this is Taxodium distichum, the bald cypress. And this species of tree is the oldest wetland tree in the world. There are accounts of trees still living today on the PD, the Little PD River, just maybe 50 miles from here, that are around 4,000 years of age. There are verified trees in the Black River, Three Sisters Swamp in North Carolina, verified through core drilling, dendrochronology, 2,360 years old. Oh, wow. And the tree that was core dated 2,360 years old is a little bit bigger than this tree, just a little bit bigger. So this tree, we can be pretty confident that it is over 1,000 years old. Wow. It is completely hollow inside. If I were to walk up and thump on it, which you know what, I'll risk the ivy. It is hollow, and there's actually a turkey vulture nest inside, but there are probably dozens of creatures, different species of creatures living inside this tree. Probably hundreds of individual creatures. Yeah. So it's probably 8 inches to 10 inches thick of living, growing wood. And then inside it's hollowed out. And one of the amazing things about these trees, you know, how do they live so long in this muddy, swampy, wet terrain? First off, you see all the cypress knees around us, right? Yeah. Well, close to this tree, all these cypress knees are pretty big and gnarly, but a tree of this size, you can expect it to have a root network of about a ½ acre.
Wow. Oh, no kidding.
Wow.
We can be sure that all of these cypress knees in this little patch that I'm standing on, all of these belong to this mother tree. Now the really cool thing, it's, if you can imagine, they're like interlocking hands, right? All of these knees are like Velcro. And underneath the mud, they spread out again in this fibrous network, grown thick and strong. And they interlock with the knees of other cypress trees. They also interlock with the root systems of holly, of tupelo, of oak. They interlock with other species. So they hold hands. And so in this muddy, swampy terrain, when the winds blow, when the hurricanes come, it's my GoPro, and the forest is shaking, they've got this Velcro foundation that stretches all through the swamp, and they're all connected to each other, and so they all hold each other up. And that's pretty incredible, just thinking of the size of this tree, the tonnage of this tree. So if we go back 80 years, this would have been a forest of stumps, except for this tree alone. Wow. Everything around us would have been cleared. Everything, it would have been barren. It would have been horrible to witness. That would have been the only tree, right? But then if you go back 200 years prior, if you go back to the 1500s, this would have been a forest like it is now, but all of the trees, or most of the trees would be that size. It would have been this forest, this swamp of giants. And so you've got this interlocking structure. These knees communicate with each other. They use dye. They use dyes to test this, but they found that they could put dye in one part of the swamp near a cypress knee, and that dye will show up 100 yards away in a tupelo root. And so that we know that they're exchanging liquids, they're exchanging nutrients, they're exchanging information. They are indeed helping each other, different species of trees, which is so fascinating. The other cool adaptation is that they become hollow. So when you have a tree of that size, if that were dense all the way through, think of the many thousands of tons that would weigh. So all that weight, all that mass. And so how does the tree figure out how to survive through the storms? Well, the center of the tree, the woodpeckers come, the ivory-billed woodpeckers, the pileated woodpeckers come, they'll bore holes into the side of the tree. And then as the years go by, the rain gets in there, water sits in these little cavities that the woodpeckers have dug out. And that water sits and it begins to rot the wood. And then the grubs get in there, and the termites and the beetles, which that's what the woodpeckers feed on. And so over the many generations, these trees, like a smaller cypress like this one, is completely strong, it's completely dense through and through, but as they get big, they get these pockets and they indeed become rotted out, and then over time what that ends up being is the entire core of that tree becomes hollowed out. And I've seen dozens of these large trees, and every one of them is hollowed out. And it's a process that takes hundreds of years, and it's dozens of organisms that add into that. It's the woodpeckers, it's the parakeets, it's the grubs and beetles, it's the raccoons that get in there and dig out their little nest. And so I know for a fact, because I've seen them, that there are turkey vultures nesting in that tree. There are also probably raccoons. There are probably different snakes. There are all sorts of beetles and birds. Prothonotary warblers, when they fly up from Brazil, nest in those trees. And so the inside of that tree is like a city for all sorts of critters. And so it's, again, if you look up, you'll notice the top of that tree actually has broken off at one point. So as these trees keep growing and getting taller, they hollow out within, but when the storms come, they have this ability to shed, to break the tops off. So a lot of the largest ones, the tops will break off, but they just keep living. They just keep growing. They keep growing denser. This one is leaning quite a bit, but there's a large limb that's almost a counterbalance on the other side of the tree, growing in the opposite direction. So that tree is trying, it knows that it's starting to lean, so it's trying to counterbalance that weight. This tree was here in the 1500s as the Spanish were struggling through the Carolinas and fleeing. It was here in the 1000 AD when the Vikings first made it to Newfoundland, right? The very first Europeans. This tree was here, and it would have been a little smaller back then, but it would have been here. The natives that have been here for thousands of years, this tree would have sat witness to their comings and goings. You can think with trees of this size, maybe in the latter years, in the 1700s, 1800s, any indigenous people that were left out in this area, they would have prayed at this tree, that this would have been one of the last. They would have understood the significance. So this is a spiritual site, but it also it really gives us that tangible connection going back even possibly to the time of Christ. So to be able to witness something that shows that space and time, it lets us know how fleeting and small we are. And then it also reminds us it holds us accountable for the things we've done as humans. This forest was full of those magnificent trees, right, of that size. And we also can think about the ivory-billed woodpecker and the Carolina parakeets that lived off of this tree, right? They're now gone, but the tree's still here to remind us. And so these places, for me, it's like, it just reminds us of where we've come from, and then that allows us to look forward to where we're going and hopefully make better decisions. So that's extremely important to who we are, and we've got to make sure that my great-great-grandkids, when I'm long gone, that they can still do this in their kayaks, probably with solar-powered motors. we gotta make sure that we keep these places alive. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you all. I'm tickled to bring people out.
It worries me. I used to work in the city, and Manhattan Water Company, the logo of Chase Manhattan Bank is a cross-section of the trees that were hollowed out to be the water pipes for Manhattan. And I'm wondering if everyone kept saying, well, how did they hollow them out? Maybe they were cutting down these, which were hollowed out.
The cypress trees grow all the way up until the northeast. And they grow all the way west into Texas. They're predominantly southeast, but now if you go up to the northeast, you're not going to have these same cypress swamps. The cool thing about these trees is they also grow just as good in more solid ground, sandy ground. And so like in Polly's, there's a few spots where you'll see cypress trees just growing out of the ground next to pine trees. But yeah, you'll see them all over the East Coast and into Texas. I've been reading a lot about trees, and I learned about the American chestnut, which are now all gone. And the American chestnuts were a similar size. You know, they were like our giant oak trees, and they suffered from the leaf blight. And then also the American elm was also eradicated because of an invasive fungus. And so it is very possible that some fungus, you know, just like we have viruses, there are fungi that come in and can wipe out entire tree species. So that's another thing that we've lost so many great trees, and a lot of people, especially people my age, have no clue. Like I ask my friends, they don't even know what's the American chestnut. They don't know what that means. And we have billions of amazing giant chestnut trees.
Is there another chestnut that's still around?
Chinese chestnut.
Have they real prickly out?
And they have like a red, or I think they might be called red chestnut. Buckeye. They're all in the same family as buckeye, but the American chestnut was the edible kind, and they were sweet, apparently very sweet nuts. The colonies would never have been sustained without the American chestnut. The natives, it was their main staple. They made bread out of it, out of the nuts. So we lost, the American chestnut was probably the greatest American tree, and now they're all gone. And
How you live through the winter with eating your chestnut.
Yep. There are maybe 24 trees of that size left in the Carolinas, or comparable to that. Maybe 24 that at least people have been able to find. And a lot of people keep them very close guarded secrets. I'm trying to catalog and find all of them, not to make them public at all, but some of them, like this one, you know, this is a water trail that people should have access to. But I hope that if I can catalog as many as possible, that you know, we could build some sort of database, maybe get some scientists to come out and core date a few of them. Once we can get accurate numbers on how old they are, you know, that could lead to further protections. Well, that's the thing, and so kind of part of my job is making sure that you know, the locations aren't public. You know, I can show the trees and talk about them, but I have to be very careful that technically this one is public knowledge. So I want to take students out here. You know, I want people to be able to see this and learn from it. But yeah, certainly most of them need to be kept hidden. Right. But I think, though, that we still need to know about them. Because if people don't know that they exist, then how can you protect it? You know, if it's unknown, if it's completely unknown, you know, the big worry is just that if there are these great trees out on properties that developers get their hands on,
Right.
and no one's
Sorry.
Everyone's watching.
yeah, I'm on something.
Oh,
If-
you're on something.
if
so
no one's
you want us to get
aware-
out of your way?
That these trees are out here,
Uh-huh.
and then a timber company comes out, you know, they'll just keep logging and not care.
And aren't they now selling cypress bulk?
Yep, that is the big threat. The timber industry has a renewed effort here in South Carolina in the name of cypress mulch. And so they're not mowing the big trees down, but a lot of the smaller ones they're taking down. And again, how are we ever gonna get old growth forests back if we keep cutting the smaller ones?
We used to have a little 1920s craftsman bungalow and had all the original chestnut in it still. And but one by one, these little houses, people would modernize them. And I used to see that chestnut trucked in the dumpster. It used to break my heart. I mean, if I saw
He'd
it,
go get it.
I would go get it.
That's
So I had a nice big pile of chestnut.
And we gave it away to people who
We knew we'd make use
value
of
it.
it.
Yeah, that is a thing. A lot of the modernization, people have no clue what they're getting rid of.
We have no clue.
Or, you know, a lot of people, I've said this, I hate cookie cutter condos, but I love the people in them. You know, people move here not knowing what was there before the development came in. So it's, you know, it's not their fault. They were sold by the developers and by the realtors. They were sold this idea, and a lot of these places will be named, you know, like wilderness type names, you know, Cypress, the Cypress Boulevard or Cypress Plantation, right? It's their,
Salt Marsh Cove.
yeah, they're named after the places that were destroyed in creating the neighborhood.
Okay, we're running out. We need to wait. Oh, they are? Okay. All right.
No worries.
No worries. So, I've heard that the cypress trees breathe through their leaves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, so and that's why the knees, that's their other kind of purpose. That's why they poke up out of the water so that when the floods come, the rains come, and the water level does rise, these knees will be able to poke out and yes, aspirate. In a flooded landscape, they're kind of the extra set of lungs for the tree.
Okay.
And that's an interesting thing that they also probably breathe for the other tree species. When it floods, this tree is probably getting a little help by the cypress knees that it's intermeshed with.
It's sort of like a capillary system.
It really is. And it's, I mean, I like to think of it as a big cell. And it's like they're all organelles kind of working. They're individual, but they're also working together in subtle ways. And this is all kind of very, very new science. And so it's pretty exciting, you know. It paints a whole different picture.
Tuesday and Wednesday of this week, traditionally. Today, Thursday, is the Feast of the Ascension, on which we remember the resurrected Jesus ascending back to heaven after appearing to the disciples and giving us some final instructions, right? So, I want to be mindful today of the suffering and tragedies that we've been hearing about, particularly the folks in Uvalde, Texas, and what's gone on at that school. And I was struck, honestly, as Marsh was talking about the community that sort of lives within this cypress tree, the part of this tree, of how interconnected we all are. And how, Jesus promises that where 2 or 3 are gathered in His name, He will be in the midst of us. So I know Jesus is present today, and I know that even in the midst of enormous suffering and trauma, that Jesus is there as well. So, let us pray. Holy God, You give Your people a desire to know and to worship You. Bless all who gather in Your name, in fields, on streams, and seas, and factory floors, in refugee encampments, in schoolhouses, in all places where we are called to work, leisure, and service, and in churches and houses of worship, that we may find a welcome and lift our hearts and voices in praise of you, who makes us a new creation in Jesus Christ, through whom we pray. Amen.
Amen.
And thanks, everyone.
Thank you for your...
I actually might paddle back out to the tree because I forgot. I wanted to get a panorama shot looking straight up at it. So I might just head back out there and do that.
You want a hand loading that little one?
I'll be able to get it.
We have Emma Rose, one of our youth, is preaching this week.
See that bird. I just saw it in flight, and it very well could be an ivory-billed woodpecker. It had the exact white wing markings, but that is also an indicator of what the pileated has. However, this is a big one. If it would just give me one more glimpse. Just gotta hope it will fly back. I don't really want to go too much deeper. Oh, there it is, there it is, there it is. Oh. Right there, you see it. That is a beautiful pileated. Beautiful. What a wonderful excursion that was. Deep into this cypress swamp. Through poison ivy and mud. Snake and gator filled swamps, chasing a ghost, an extinct woodpecker, and searching for giant ancient trees. You can hear boats going by because the river is not too far away. That woodpecker. You can hear him back there teasing me. Like, come on a little farther into the swamp, get lost. Come looking for ghosts. That's the thing. I am 15 feet from my kayak. And if you're not looking exactly at it, you're not gonna see it. Look at these little sparrows. So yeah, lesson. If you leave your boat, do not go too far. Oh, shnikes, and there's a hornet. Don't go too far from your boat. Watch out for hornets. Hornets are a huge problem out here. And it's not like you can run away. If you stumble into a huge hornet nest, you have to deal with them while you slog it through this muddy, stumpy environment. Oh, this is also not a good place to run into a large alligator, because I'm moving about as best as I can. But no risk, no reward, right?